Welcome to the MECERN podcast. This is the podcast where we talk to MECERN members and associates about their recent or current research into the medieval world of Central Europe. I'm Karen Culver, and today it's my great pleasure to be talking with Grzegorz Pac about symbolic capital and a saintly bishop in medieval Poland. Grzegorz completed his studies at the Historical Institute of the University of Warsaw and at Queen's University in Belfast under a Socrates Erasmus Scholarship in 2006. He defended his doctoral thesis in 2011 and spent that academic year as a research fellow at the University of Notre Dame. The following 3 years, he was a postdoc at the Institute of History at Adam Mickiewicz University in Poznan as part of the NCN Postdoctoral Fellowship. Since 2013, Grzegorz has been working at the Historical Institute at the University of Warsaw and then at the Faculty of History at the University of Warsaw. He received his habilitation in 2020. Grzegorz's main research interests are early Polish Middle Ages, the cult of saints and the Virgin Mary, hagiography, the social role of women in queenship, and the ideology of power and monasticism. When he's not working, Grzegorz enjoys birdwatching and notes that the marshy land around the parts of the Vistula offer the opportunity of seeing some rare and migratory birds. Grzegorz, welcome to the MECERN podcast.
Hi Karen. Thanks for having me. Hi everyone.
You're very welcome. It's good to meet you at last, and a fellow birdwatcher.
Always a pleasure.
Today we are going to be talking about the canonization of saints by the Latin Church, focusing on New Europe. This will be partially based on your recent paper, Holy Bishops, Papal Canonization and the Legitimization of Power in the 13th Century Poland and Norway, which you wrote in collaboration with Stefan Hoppe of the University of Oslo. But first, please, for the uninitiated like me, and to set the scene, briefly, what was the process of canonization and how did it change?
Oh, it changed radically through the history, in fact. When we talk about, many scholars at least, when they talk about canonization, they think only about papal canonization, which was a relatively new thing in the Middle Ages, which appeared in the 10th century. So many scholars prefer to talk rather about recognition of saints or formalization of cults when the Pope was not involved. So at the very beginning, when the first martyr appeared, there was no formal process. There was simply, as Latin proverb says, vox populi, vox Dei. So when people consider somebody to be worthy to be venerated as a saint, he or she was venerated. Usually it was a case of martyrs. But then the problem appeared, first in North Africa, when Christians were divided between Catholics and Donatists. And then sometimes local bishops recognize that somebody who is considered as a saint, who is venerated by people, it was in fact heretic from their perspective. So at the beginning of the 5th century, they decided that the local bishops should take care on any aspect of the cult of saints, including the various forms of recognition of sainthood. And later on, this process started to be more and more formal. Then at the beginning of the 9th century, on the Council of Mainz, it was decided that in fact it shouldn't be done only by the local bishop. It should be rather a council or a group of bishops involved, and also the local ruler should be informed about that. And then during the next centuries, the papacy started to be more and more involved. The first papal canonization is St. Ulrich of Augsburg. But in all those cases, it was the local churches who had an initiative, who asked Pope to be involved somehow in various forms in this recognition. And then in the 13th century, it was the Pope Gregor IX who decided that this is the only legal form of recognition of sainthood. So to recognize a new cult, you have to always ask the Pope and the Roman Church. And then the procedures also appeared, which is known as a canonization process with some sort of inquisition. So the research on the virtues and miracles of the candidate to the altars. But one thing should be stressed here. On the one side, you have a canon law, which since 1234, so the decretals of Gregor IX, are very strict, that it is only Pope who can recognize and formalize cults. But then there was a practice which, through the whole Middle Ages, was different. And in fact, until the Council of Trent in the 16th century, there was still a lot of local saints recognized only by local bishops or local councils. And even more, on the one side, papacy repeat those rules and remind the local churches about those rules related with papal monopoly. On the other, it seems that in practice the papacy didn't care very much. So in fact, even in the 13th, 14th, and 15th century, these saints who were formally canonized by the Pope was just a small group in the great numbers of the saints recognized by local churches, by local bishops. So it was still something, maybe it would be too much to say unusual, but still something which is not common.
Yeah, I can sort of see that the Pope is, or the popes are trying to increase their authority, but perhaps not quite managing it.
Yeah, and in fact, many scholars stress that papacy was not so much involved in the cult of saints. Um, in many cases, it was rather the local churches who wanted to use the authority of papacy, of Rome, to make their saints more important, to add to this cult of their local saints some special value, thanks to the papal recognition.
In your paper, you mentioned different types of saints. Now, I just thought a saint was a saint. So please, could you explain with examples what were the most important and popular types of saints and why?
So this typology of saints is something I think quite important to understand the phenomenon as such. So the main division was and is still the division between martyrs and confessors. So between those who died defending faith or who was believed to die for Christ and those who simply, maybe not, it's not so simple probably, lived a pious life. And it is good to remember that the first group of saints, the first who were venerated, were martyrs. This is the beginning of the cult of saints. And then confessors appeared later, together with the monasticism, when people such as St Antonius of Egypt were already during their lives believed to be especially pious, but they were not martyrs. So they were venerated, although they didn't die for Christ. So this is the simplest division between those two groups. But then obviously there are different ones in both. So you can have bishops, you can have monks, you can have rulers as a saint, so that's a different types. Interestingly, there is a gender difference. So in the case of men, you have many different groups related with their social role. When in the case of women, the main division between saints are they could be widows. I mean, of course, they could be martyrs or confessors, but they could be widows or virgins. So this is very much related with their marital status. Um, so this is the simplest way to explain typology. And when you ask which group were popular and when, so this is very much related with the religious mentality and the religious life in the various times. So, for example, it is quite obvious that in the early Middle Ages, the sainthood was, as some scholars say, monasticized. So the monastic virtues were considered to be the one related with sanctity. For example, chastity. So it was very difficult to be a lay person living in regular life, marriage life also, and to be considered as a saint. Of course, it's possible when somebody was widow or widower for a long time. When you look to the contemporary saints, the saints who were elevated to the altars by the popes in the last century, you can find a lot of married people. And this is obviously related with the changes in how church thinks about marriage and how people think about sanctity differently. On the other hand, you can also show, to come back to what is called sometimes New Europe, that, for example, Haki Antonsson noted that the monastic saints were not very popular in Scandinavia just after conversion. And he suggested that the society was not Christianized enough to understand values related with monasticism. So they venerated very much martyrs because it was probably simpler to understand martyrdom, and it was more related with their way of thinking, which was still very much enrooted in the pagan times. And also, we are talking today about holy bishops. Obviously, inside those groups, through the century, different elements of biography of saints could be stressed or more needed for different reasons. So, as we tried to present in our paper, although saints bishops were very popular in the church through the whole centuries, obviously there are differences between saints bishops in the early Middle Ages and in the high Middle Ages, especially after canonization of Thomas of Canterbury, Thomas Becket.
Yeah, I was going to ask about him because you've mentioned holy bishops and bishops who've become saints, and I'm aware that Thomas Becket, Thomas of Canterbury, was quite an early one. And you say that this was a real turning point in making bishops into saints. Can you explain further, please?
Yeah, you can't really say that Thomas was early because Martin was one of the first holy bishops. But Thomas Becket obviously is a turning point because he presents a new type, let's say, inside this type of holy bishop. This is related, of course, with Gregorian reform and the changes which happened in the church since mid-11th century. So Thomas Becket was a figure of the bishop who is presented as the one who defends so-called libertas ecclesiae, so liberty of the church, which in his case is related with the right of clergy to be judged only by the ecclesiastical courts. So he was murdered after his conflict with a ruler. And of course, if you look to the period before, you can find many bishops killed by rulers during some political struggles, sometimes by the citizens of the city who were against them and so on. But not so many of them were considered to be saints. But after Gregorian reform, when figures such as Thomas Becket, who was killed during a conflict of the ruler, when he, as was believed, defended some rights of the church, some rights which were very much stressed by the supporters of the Gregorian reforms, some sort of an independency of the church from the ruler. He was very much needed figure for the church struggling with secular powers. So Thomas Becket was the figure which presents those aspirations of the church, the authority, and who could be seen as a martyr who died defending those rights of the church. So this is one important thing, that he was in this sense a new type of the martyr because he died for Christ, as it was believed, but in the sense that he defended the church and the rights of the church and also a power of the church. And after that, if you look to the next decade, you can find at least a few examples of the similar figures. In most of the cases, they were not killed, but for example, it was believed that Thomas Becket was also in the exile for some time, which is not true, by the way. But his story was presented that before he was killed, he was also forced to go to exile. So later on, you can see a couple of bishops who are venerated as a saints because they suffer during the conflict with local rulers and had to go to the exile because they were defenders of the church. So this is one aspect. And another aspect is that papal canonization of Thomas Becket happened very quickly after his death. It was the first papal canonization when the canonization letter, so-called the bull, was addressed not only to the local church, but to the whole church. And in fact, this cult spread immediately in the whole Europe. We see that everywhere. In Poland, in Hungary, not only in England and France, which was quite natural, but also in Scandinavia, in Central Europe, really everywhere. It is very much related with the fact that it was supported by the Cistercians, who had this network of their order everywhere. But it also showed how useful the canonization could be as a sort of leverage for a cult. So also from this perspective, the case of Thomas Becket was a turning point because it shows how useful canonization could be to promote the new cult.
And did kings also venerate Thomas?
Yes, and not only kings, but also the king, the one who was responsible for his death. So Henry II was forced to make a penance and to make a pilgrimage to the grave of Thomas. But it was related to very particular political circumstances. But I guess that rulers willingly venerate Thomas Becket because they really believe he is a saint. So they wanted him to help them to be the celestial intercessor and so on. So when he was established as a saint, he was venerated more or less by everyone.
But thinking on King Henry, he effectively had Thomas Becket killed, but then he was obliged to do penance and to venerate Thomas as a saint. But surely Henry must have viewed Thomas as a traitor.
Yeah, from his perspective, he was a traitor, obviously. In the Middle Ages, being a traitor is a very strange thing. There is this long tradition, especially in England, that you have a crown and a king. Like in the modern period, when the crown could be represented by the parliament against the king. But when you don't have really this division between the figure of the ruler and the state as something separate, being against the ruler is an act of trade. I would say.
It is, definitely. Yeah. In your paper, you mentioned that the saints and their veneration conferred symbolic capital to the venerators. Today, we generally consider symbolic capital as related to personal honor, recognition, and prestige of an individual or a group. And it's suggested that symbolic capital can be used to leverage social and economic capital, which in turn impacts on social hierarchies. Please, how does symbolic capital work in relationship to saints, particularly the holy bishop saints, as today we are looking at St Stanislaus of Krakow?
So, of course, when we use the term symbolic capital, we use the term taken from Pierre Bourdieu, sociologist, who showed how important for anyone who rule anywhere is the symbolic capital. So not only the poor power, but also this added value which legitimizes the position of the one. We can see that everywhere, and probably especially academic world. It is quite obvious that academic degree is a very good example of symbolic capital. You have an academic degree, and even if you're not very wise, people tended to treat you as an expert. But coming back to the Middle Ages, so when we ask ourselves what symbolic capital had an ecclesiastical institution, in the Middle Ages, the relation between the church and the patron was very, very close. When you look, for example, to the legal documents, to the donation to the monastery, let's say we have a donation to the monastery of St. Martin, let's say. In the donation, it is said, I give this or that land to St. Martin, not to the monastery of St. Martin, to St. Martin himself, because the ecclesiastical institution represent the saints, and the saint is a real owner of the institution. So from this perspective, obviously, how important, how saintly is the saint who is a patron of the institution, influence very much the symbolic capital of the institution itself, of the one who are the leaders of the institution, and so on. If you add to that the situation with the holy bishops, that you can present your own diocese as the one who was ruled by the holy bishop, which was established by the holy bishop. So when you are the bishop of the bishopric and you can say that one of your predecessor was a saint, that of course gives you an incredible legitimization. And I think this is also the case of St. Stanislaus. who was the Bishop of Krakow, who died during a conflict with the king in the second half of 11th century, with very uncertain circumstances. But under the influence of the cult of Thomas Becket, in the 13th century he started to be venerated as a saint of the same type. But he was also very useful from the perspective of those who are natural guards of this cult, so the bishops of Krakow. Because thanks to St Stanislaus, they can present the cathedral as the one who hosts the shrine of the great saints on the one side. On the other, they can also show their own bishopric as the one who was ruled in the past by the holy bishop. So, from this perspective, Krakow was a special place, and it might be especially important in Poland because exactly in the same period, in Gniezno, so in the archbishopric see, we can see that the beginning of a tradition showing St Adalbert as the one who established Gniezno archbishopric, which historically was not a truth.
Having read your paper, I realized that the power struggles to gain canonization for Stanislav seem very confusing and multi-layered, and obviously very different from the way that Thomas of Canterbury was canonized very quickly. Please, can you explain what was going on with St Stanislav?
Indeed, this is very, very strange story, especially comparing with this very fast canonization of Thomas Becket, because St Stanislaus was killed in 1070s during the conflict with the king, but the circumstances of his death are very uncertain. And for the next few centuries, or at least for the next decades, he was not venerated as a saint. He was not considered as a saint, and by at least some circles, he was believed to be a traitor. But later on, in the beginning of the 13th century, when Vincentius Kadłubek wrote his chronicle, he was the first to present St Stanislaus as a saint. And probably this is not a coincidence that Vincentius was not only the chronicler, but later on he was also the Bishop of Krakow. So it is generally believed that the beginning of the cult of St Stanislaus was related with the influence of the cult of Thomas Becket. And then Stanislaus received his legend as a figure very similar to Becket, as the one who was a good shepherd of the Krakow church, who defend people against the tyrannous king, and who finally was killed by him. So obviously, the cult of St Stanislaus was very much supported by bishops of Krakow for many reasons. Because, first of all, I think it was a great argument in any discussion with the ruler. Partly because the story of St Stanislaus suggests that the church might be right. I mean, you can always use the example of bad King Boleslaus, who killed Stanislaus as a sort of a tyrant figure, and suggest that the ruler is a sort of a tyrant being against the Krakow church. So this is one reason. But another reason is more general, that simply having a very important saint, Church of Krakow, the bishopric of Krakow, receive a special legitimization, receive a symbolic capital, because they started to be a guardian of the very important cult. And they also can present themselves as the successors of the holy bishop, which gives them a special position. But that was important not only in their relation with secular rulers, because we know that quite quickly Stanislaus started to be also very popular for regular peoples. So obviously the pilgrimages started before and after canonization.
Well, I guess if they've got pilgrimages starting, you could actually say that the canonization prompted a tourist industry.
You are, of course, right. I mean, there are obviously incomes from that. And this is also part of the story. So this special position received by the church, thanks to the saint, was important not only in the contact of ecclesiastical institution with elites, but also with regular people, because that gives us tool to influence them and also to make them coming and bringing money. But interestingly, I think in the case of St Stanislaus, it was also important inside the church as an institution. Obviously, there was a sort of competition between ecclesiastical institutions about which one is more important and which one is less important, and it is very clear in Poland in the 13th century, when, first of all, there is an archbishop in Gniezno, that obviously Krakow had some special ambitions. So they have this ambition to be something more than just a regular bishopric. But another thing is that Krakow bishop had a papal privilege from the end of the 12th century, that they have a right to be the second one in the Polish church province. So, for example, during a council, they are the second to speak just after the archbishop. But in practice, in the 13th century, in many cases, Bishop of Wrocław took this place. So, from this perspective, we can also look to the beginning of the cult of St Stanislaus as some sort of attempt of the Krakow Church to receive a special legitimization also in the struggle between bishoprics on their position inside the church province. And this is probably not a coincidence that this papal privilege of being second in Polish church province was given again just 3 years after St Stanislaus' canonization. And in the privilege, the Pope said that he is giving this privilege because he believed that the church, which has such a great saint as St Stanislaus, should have some special privileges, should be honored in some special way because of St Stanislaus. So that, I think, shows very well how the cult of saints, in this case St Stanislaus, could be useful in this sort of power struggles between ecclesiastical institutions.
Yes, and I just keep thinking, of course, now Krakow, they've got another, or they had another bishop, if I remember correctly, who then became a pope and has become a saint.
True, true. And this is quite interesting because, as I said, the initiative always came from the local churches. I said in the very beginning that still in the 13th century there were many ways to create a new saint. And you can ask yourself, why in fact they decided for this Roman way of recognition of sainthood? And of course, one answer is that they wanted to be very strict with what was written in the canon law. But you can also say that this was also the way to make your saint more important. Because of course, theoretically all saints are equal, they're all in the heaven, but in practice, some were more important for many reasons. For example, some were believed to be more powerful in making miracles. So saints had a symbolic capital. And by the papal recognition, saints received some special symbolic capital. Of course, this is also related with the question of being local or, let's say, international. In fact, in many cases, papal canonization didn't really give you the veneration worldwide. But in fact, the local churches asking for papal approval, then with this papal stamp, which of course made the cults more important. But you had also another ways to straighten the cult. For example, receiving papal indulgence. And we can see that bishops of Krakow were very active in asking Pope for and receiving those indulgence for those coming to the grave of St. Stanislaus. So from this perspective, of course, that straightened the cult because people came as pilgrims, as we already said, but also strengthened the Church of Krakow itself.
And I suppose papal canonization would help explain why some saints became megastars and others were local heroes.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, in this period, it is quite difficult to imagine the saint who would be megastar without papal canonization. As I said, it was still possible to have papal canonization and not become a star, to stay on this local level. But obviously Stanislaus was a sort of a megastar, at least in the regional level. So first of all, he was widely venerated in Poland. He quite quickly received the status of being the second patron of Poland, together with St. Adalbert. But when we look to Bohemia or Hungary, we can find the name of St. Stanislaus on the calendars. We know about some pilgrims coming and so on. So this is the case of the successful cult. And in this case, it seems that it is very much related also with the ambitions of the Church of Krakow to create him as somebody more than just a local saint.
Yeah, we're talking Krakow. Do you think the fact that Stanislav was a bishop of Krakow, a peripheral state, Poland, Do you think that made a difference in making him a saint, or the attitude of the Pope compared to the centre, Rome?
We are focusing today on St Stanislaus only, but in fact, in our article with Stefan, we focus on two saints, St Stanislaus of Einstein of Nidaros, of Trondheim, and we compare those cases. So we also ask ourselves the question if there is a difference in the canonization, because Einstein was not canonized, but the Norwegian bishops and the Norwegian king really tried him to be canonized for a long time without success. And we don't really know what is the reason why they were not successful. But we also try to look to general trends. And we also ask ourselves about the tension between center and periphery, because obviously both Poland and Norway, or Krakow and Trondheim, were periphery of Latin Europe in the High Middle Ages. And we ask ourselves exactly the same question you just asked, if there was a difference in the attitude of papacy. And we believe there was. And not only in the attitude of papacy, which I'm going to come back in a moment, but also in the attitude of the promoters of the cults. So when we look to those cases of canonization, we notice that most of them, in the periphery, rulers were very much involved. So there was a sort of a tendency to create this attempt to canonize a new saint as a sort of a, in quotation mark, of course, a national affair, And from this perspective, it is very interesting that it seems that in the case of St. Stanislaus, Duke of Krakow was not involved. In the papal documents, he is not mentioned as the one who wanted St. Stanislaus to be canonized. And I believe this is related with this problematic character of this figure from the perspective of the secular power, of course. But coming back to the papacy, just to explain a little bit how the canonization process looked like. So to check the potential new saints, to the candidate to the altars, the Pope always established a commission. Usually he appointed the local ecclesiastical prelates to this commission. But in some cases, it seems that Rome was not very happy with the effect of this of work of the first commission, and another commission was created. And when we look to those cases, it started to be quite clear to us that it happened more often in the case of the peripheral cases. In fact, it is something which our André Vaucher already noted, that it is possible that the papacy was more suspicious in the case of some remote churches who asked somebody to be established by Rome as a saint. And when we look to numbers, it seems that Vaucher was right. For example, Einstein of Trondheim had, I don't really remember how many commissions, but many of them. Of course, sometimes the new commission was appointed because, I don't know, one member of the former commission died or something alike. So there were different reasons. But when we look generally, it seems that papacy checked saints from the periphery more carefully. And one more thing, when we look to the success rate, it was less in the periphery. If you look to Central Europe in this period, in fact, there were only two saints who were finally canonized. So it is Stanislaus and Hedwig of Silesia. And there was some other attempts, for example, Margaret of Hungary, the Dominican. And there was a couple of commissions established to check her sainthood. And it seems that she was, generally speaking, at least in Hungary, she was really believed to be a saint. And there was some miracles were recorded and so on, but it never ended with the papal canonization. So the success rate also suggests that from the perspective of Rome, everything which is not Rome itself is a periphery in the sense. There were closer peripheries and, this more remote peripheries, which probably were considered to be strange, maybe not so Christian really, because, they were converted later and so on.
I can well understand that. Distance always breeds nervousness. And on that interesting note, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. Grzegorz, thank you so much for talking to us today. It's been really, really interesting.
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. Today I've been talking to Grzegorz Pac about his research into symbolic capital and a saintly bishop in medieval Poland. My thanks to everyone for listening. I hope you found it as interesting, informative and enjoyable as I did. Please do look out for the next MECERN podcast, in which MECERN members and associates talk about their recent or current research into the medieval world of Central Europe. And if you have research that you or your colleagues are doing and you would like to talk about it to MECERN, do contact me through the MECERN board or website administrator. I'm Karen Culver for the MECERN podcast. Thank you and goodbye until the next time.